So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining for today's Flash Talks. Shana and I are excited to kick off the Flash Talks today. My name is Keshia Harris, and I'm a research scientist at the Center on the Ecology of Early Development. My colleague, Shana Rochester, is a research associate at the Sherman Center for Early Learning in urban communities at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County and a consultant at SEED. So we will be speaking about emerging scholarship on racially affirming children's books at SEED. And we also want to acknowledge um, our team, Jacqueline Sims, who's also a research scientist at SEED, as well as, of course, Stephanie Carrington, who is executive director at SEED. So in addition, we'd like to acknowledge our collaborators, postdoctoral fellow NECA, and our undergraduate research assistants at SEED as well, Beverly, Christine, Antonella, and Maya. Oh, I see that Christine's last name is spelled incorrect. It's actually Hong with a U, so apologies, Christine. As well as our collaborators at the University of Pittsburgh. Our work has been inspired by our collaboration with the Pittsburgh Reading Racial Equity and Relationship Study.
So before talking specifically about racial socialization as it relates to children's literature, I thought it would be really important for us to provide a brief overview of racial socialization more broadly. And so Lassane Brown defines racial socialization as the specific verbal and nonverbal messages that are transmitted to younger generations for the development of values, attitudes, behaviors, beliefs regarding the meaning and significance of race and racial stratification and intergroup and intragroup interactions, and personal and group identity. I know that's a mouthful, but it's really comprehensive definition of racial socialization. And some people may be thinking that this definition is a little dated, but top researchers in the field of racial socialization, like Rihanna Anderson and Howard Stevenson, still refer to this comprehensive definition in their scholarship. So when we think about socializing children around race, there are several different contexts in which this socialization takes place. For example, children's immediate environment, which could include their direct interactions with their family members, neighbors, schools, and the interactions between those contexts. And those indirect interactions or indirect contexts can include experiences that their family members might have, such as racial discrimination at the workplace, that can inform the types of messages that around race that parents transmit to their children. Another consideration is the societal context of these messages, such as the values, beliefs, and laws of the society, which may contradict the experiences of Black families, whose experiences with things like law enforcement and laws may differ from mainstream society. And then the final context to really consider these messages being transmitted in is time, or the current racial and political environment, which can determine the types of messages that are important at a particular time. Now, there is some consensus around the content of these socialization messages, and that can include cultural socialization messages, or messages that teach about aspects of Black life, like cultural traditions, ancestral legacy as a means to promote racial pride. There are preparation for bias messages that are related to racial discrimination in particular, and it can include strategies to resist or cope with negative experiences. There's promotion of mistrust, or messages that emphasize a need for wariness or distrust of interactions with individuals from different racial ethnic backgrounds. And then there's egalitarianism, which are messages that are completely silent about race. Now, the modes by which caregivers transmit these messages are also important. So Lassane Brown's definition implies that these messages can be verbal or nonverbal, but they can also be purposely transmitted or explicitly, or they can be inadvertent or implicit. And for example, deliberate and verbal transmission could include direct conversations that parents have with their children. And in fact, much of the scholarship on racial socialization really focuses on these types of messages. But children's literature in particular, affirming children's literature, can be used in explicit verbal ways if parents are reading and discussing the content of the books with children, but they can also be used non-verbally to transmit messages if the books are available for children to engage with on their own. And so because of this flexibility with children's literature and with affirming books in particular, it's important to determine the types of messages that these books can transmit in an effort to support Black families who aim to support their children's development. So Seed curated a list of racially affirming books for Black children in 2020, and this work was completed as a part of our work with a larger project, the Pittsburgh Reading Racial Equity and Relationships, or the 3R study. And this list includes books that feature the full humanity of children of color as main or supporting characters, and who show as main characters and show a range of emotions, ideas, and identities. And so our content analysis project focuses on a subset of these racially affirming texts, about 113 out of the over 300 books. And we use 3 inclusion criteria to select our books. The first was that the books needed to be written for children in pre-K through grade 3. The second was that it needed to contain 32 or fewer pages. And the third, it needed to feature a Black main or supporting character. And we were interested in how these books depict Black characters generally, such as their social roles, their setting, how old the character is, as well as aspects of racial socialization for Black children in particular. And so we're currently using a critical content analysis methodology to examine inequities in power dynamics that may be included in our sample of texts. And we slightly modified the conceptualization of racial socialization as it applies to children's literature in particular. So we included the 4 categories mentioned by Lassane Brown, and we redefined egalitarianism to include messages about dimensions of individuals' lived experiences like hobbies and spirituality that don't acknowledge the character's race. So put another way, we define egalitarianism as the qualities of characters that are independent of one's racial ethnic group membership. In addition, we added a cross-racial relationship component that includes positive messages like cooperative play, negative messages like discrimination, or neutral messages like characters are in line for ice cream together between Black characters and those from different racial ethnic backgrounds. And in addition to coding for racial socialization, we are coding books for the 5 dimensions of critical race theory to further understand how race and racism for the books that explicitly discuss these topics are communicated. So our team has developed a code book for analyzing children's books and have coded about half of the books in our sample. We have a few emerging themes around the importance of family and intergenerational relationships that we hope can inform caregivers in conjunction with their existing messages, how they use affirming books to support their children's literacy and identity development.
So now we wanted to talk to you all about what racial socialization looks like in the home. This next sort of area of our focus is not foreign to many of you. Many parents have become educators for their children during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm sure a lot of people on the call can relate to that. 2020's intertwined pandemics, COVID-19, and continuous systemic racism have also increased the amount of time and opportunities that caregivers with young children have to discuss topics like social injustice. But research literature indicates that families are key contributors to conversations about race and racism, particularly in home literacy practices. Parents from racially minoritized backgrounds, particularly Black parents, they often seek resources and organizations outside of school to support their children's learning experiences and maximize cultural relevancy as well as opportunities for racial representation. So our approach at SEED is to expand upon the educational practices that Black families are already engaging in to promote racial socialization and healing from racial stress by reading racially affirming children's picture books with their children. I think we can. Thank you. So at Seed, as we wanted to start off acknowledging our team because this is really a group effort. We're all working together and pulling our different skills and talents together to develop a home literacy conceptual model for researchers and practitioners. And the point of this is so that the researchers and practitioners can support reading and racial socialization practices among families, so within the home. And our guiding research question is, how can parents use children's picture books specifically with a protagonist of color to promote racial socialization in the home? Thank you. Our model really positions books as a vehicle for helping Black children to develop a positive racial identity, to encourage strong family relationships, to promote racial healing, so healing from racial discrimination, racial stress, and to engage in positive self narratives. So, well, I wanted to for everyone. Our focus on positive racial really centers on scholars like Margaret Bill Spencer and Robert Sellers, which emphasizes positive attitudes and beliefs about the attributes and opportunities available to Black people in early childhood. And we intend for our model to strengthen family relationships, illustrating how books can be used to help families have particularly challenging or difficult conversations about social injustices in a safe space. Conversations about books that focus on the everyday lives of Black characters. So I know that's something that Shana mentioned, but we want to see um, the lives of Black people and Black characters really normalized doing everyday things. This can really help families to process how they're experiencing sort of external and interpersonal injustices, which we believe will facilitate a process of racial healing. So that ties back into the racial healing component. And then the last component of the conceptual model, we emphasize a focus on narratives as a way of understanding the story of our lives, with a particular emphasis on positive perspectives on one's own life story. So we anticipate a reciprocal relationship or reciprocal process with this model in which children and their families will have positive psychological outcomes in response to shared book reading practices. So we'd like to conclude our talk by really reiterating, really driving home that our model is intended to help early childhood researchers and practitioners ground literacy practices within families. Researchers and practitioners can use the findings from our content analysis work to really advance scholarship and practice that values the strengths of reading practices within Black families. So those self narratives, oral storytelling, which we can get more into during the QA, but really to acknowledge, or the breakout rather, but to acknowledge the importance of promoting healing from racial discrimination and to support conversations about social injustice in the home. So ultimately, we're really committed at SEED to advancing research and practice that values the humanity of Black children.
And I'd just like to add, given the diversity of topics covered in these racially affirming children's books that feature Black main or supporting characters, there really are many authentic opportunities for caregivers or children to initiate conversations that address the areas that we mentioned, that Keshia mentioned in our home literacy conceptual model. And so our collective work can really provide guidance for selecting texts that reflect the lived experiences of families. So before we turn it over to the next set of presenters, we'd like to just share a few questions that we're currently grappling with related to our respective projects. And we invite you during the breakout session to help us think through these questions as they relate to our two complementary projects. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.